It's November 4th, 2012, and this is the Energy Education Podcast. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairwinds Energy Education, a nonprofit whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. This week on the show, we'll follow up on Hurricane Sandy and its effect on U.S. nuclear power plants. We'll also talk about design bases. What does it mean, and how does it factor into what's happening today? Also on the show, the issue of containment venting is again in the news. We'll talk about what that means and why. Finally, Georgia ratepayers will foot the bill for a new nuclear power plant expected to cost in the billions. To discuss all of this, we'll be joined by Fairwinds Chief Engineer, Arnie Gunderson, coming up next.
Could the United States experience a meltdown like Fukushima Daiichi? Will the mainstream media tell you the whole story about the nuclear industry? When you want answers to what's going on around the world in nuclear news, Fairwinds provides them. And your donations provide the needed funds for us to keep giving you factual information from people with industry experience. Please hit the donate button.
Arnie, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
So I want to get right into Hurricane Sandy. We just did a special edition podcast, kind of a quick update after or during the hurricane. Can you just give us kind of an idea what's happened here a few days later?
Yeah, the NRC is not really telling too much, but New Jersey got hit the worst, and Oyster Creek got hit the worst of all the nuclear plants in New Jersey. Just like I said on Democracy Now! Even before the hurricane. What happened at Oyster Creek was the power went out, the off-site power went off, called loss of off-site power. And then Barnegat Bay started to rise and entered the intake structure and was either just below or just above the safety-related pumps. They're called service water pumps. One report says it was 6.5 feet and the limit is 7, and another report said it's almost 7.5 feet. So either it was a hair below or a hair above the design height of these service water pumps.
What happens if they go underwater?
Well, a nuclear reactor's got to be cooled even after it's shut down. It's not about the chain reaction. It's about these decay products that are left behind. And these pumps are what cool the plant when it's not running. Oyster Creek had been down for a week and was in a refueling mode. So all the nuclear fuel was out of the nuclear reactor and over in the fuel pool. So the fuel pool had to be cooled as opposed to the safety systems that you'd have in place after when the plant's running. What happened next is that there's something called a PNO out, which stands for a preliminary notice of occurrence, and the NRC has said that the normal shutdown cooling and the fuel pool cooling were both lost at Oyster Creek, and also that there was a loss of off-site power. Now, so what that means is that the nuclear fuel pool started to heat up. And Oyster Creek started to bring in some diesel fire pumps. Apparently, they got the situation rectified before turning the pumps on. But they were in a position where they were bringing in diesel fire pumps in order to keep the nuclear fuel pool cool because of all the problems that they were having as a result of Sandy.
Since Hurricane Sandy, the industry has really been bragging about how well their plants handled the hurricane. What can you say about that?
Well, at Oyster Creek, I don't think it handled it well at all. It's the oldest plant in the country, and it was built in 1969, so it's 44 years old. And I think what everybody seems to forget is that as a nuclear fuel pool gets hot, it starts to steam. We've seen the pictures of the steam pouring out of the Fukushima fuel pool, for instance. The building that the fuel pool is in at Oyster Creek isn't designed to handle all that moisture. So, the industry says, well, let's run some pumps in and make up for all the steam that's coming out. But, of course, the problem is that the humidity goes up in the building and all the wires start to short out. So it's not something that's been analyzed by the nuclear industry. High humidity in the reactor building is not something these plants are designed to withstand.
So if I understand, then the water typically circulates through the fuel pool, but in this case it's getting hot, evaporating off, and they're just using fire pumps to put fresh water in.
You got it. The normal temperature of a fuel pool is around 80 degrees, and it would, if there was no electricity and no pumps whatsoever, it would begin to boil in about 24 hours. So that's 300,000 gallons of water. So you think about it, going from 80 to 212 and beginning to boil in less than a day. There's an enormous amount of heat in there, and that means there's an enormous amount of steam. So yeah, if the making up for what steams out of a nuclear fuel pool is not a solution, because you're creating all this moisture that drips on the walls and causes all sorts of electrical problems. So apparently, and again, the reports won't be out for a long time if the NRC has anything to do with it, but apparently the pool did start to heat up, but not so much that they turned the fire pumps on. They were able to get the other systems back in place and begin to cool the pool before needing the fire pumps.
So Hurricane Sandy, this event, there was no need for an evacuation due to the nuclear plant. But talk about if there were a need for an evacuation due to a nuclear plant. How is that possible in a hurricane?
All the evacuation plans assume a nice sunny day. Yet Fukushima's taught us, and now Oyster Creek has taught us that it's likely that it'll be an act of God, some sort of a tornado, hurricane, whatever. And that area in New Jersey was decimated. I mean, roads were flooded, houses were washing down the street. It's kind of hard to evacuate when there's a house in your way. The other problem was that all of the emergency sirens were knocked out. So the plant was in an emergency situation called an alert status. It had no sirens, and all the streets were either clogged with sand, houses, or water. How could you have evacuated? Now, if Oyster Creek had been running, this would have been much more serious, because the service water was compromised, and it would have been difficult to cool the nuclear reactor. It's just one of those lucky things that it happened to be in a refueling outage as opposed to have been operating. It lost its service water for a period of time. It lost its ability to cool itself for a period of time. The industry seems to think that's acceptable, and I don't. It's not the only plant in New Jersey that had problems. On the opposite coast of New Jersey, on the Delaware Bay side, a plant called Salem was operating. And of course, water is very high because this low pressure is creating the water to rise in the bay. And then a large wave came in and knocked out 5 of the 6 circulating pumps. Now, they're not safety related, but the plant was running at 100% power and had to suddenly stop. One wonders the wisdom of why are you running a plant when waves are crusting into your circulating pumps. But in any event, it's down for perhaps an extended amount of time. It's hard to get salt water out of a pump. Drop your hairdryer in the kitchen sink someday and then try to turn it on and see what happens. Well, these hairdryers are thousands of horsepower. So it could be a long period of time before any of these pumps is serviceable again.
So you've talked a lot about design bases in the past, and I want to talk about that again. But first, can you just explain what design bases means in nuclear power?
Yeah, when you build a house, you build it to a building code. And here in Vermont, we assume 4 feet of snow, and in Florida, you don't have to assume 4 feet of snow. So the building code for different structures depends on where you are. But the building code is based on history, and usually building codes are based on the worst thing that can happen in 100 years for a normal civilian structure.
So a skyscraper in San Francisco would be built differently than a skyscraper in New York.
Right. Because there's different issues that the seismic issues in San Francisco, likely the hurricane issues in New York are offsetting. Yeah. So now a nuclear plant, what they'll do is they'll go back in time and they'll look at the worst flood in perhaps 500 years, the worst earthquake in a period of time, and they make a decision that whatever that worst earthquake is or whatever that worst flood is what's called the design basis event. And they designed a plant to withstand the worst that they've found in history going back a couple thousand years. Well, we've had 5 events that have either exceeded or been right at the hairy edge of design basis events in the last 18 months. And that's a concern because we're talking about events that should never happen. And we've had 5 of these things since March of last year. We had 2 seismic events. We had the earthquake at Fukushima Daiichi that likely did damage to Unit 1 and perhaps the Unit 4 fuel pool. Tokyo Electric went in and braced the heck out of it after the accident. And then here in on the East Coast, we had an earthquake over at North Anna, and that was a Richter 6. Well, North Anna was designed for a Richter 6, and it withstood a Richter 6, and that's good. But the point is not that. The point is, if a Richter 6 happened in 30 years, what could happen? What's the worst that could happen? We're talking about an event that should happen only once every 20 or 30,000 years. So the once in 1,000 year event or once in 30,000 year event happened at North Anna after only 30 years. So what does that tell us about how well we've looked back in time and what East Coast earthquakes really could be to a nuclear plant? We're in that area of the low probability, high consequence thing. We're not talking about once in 100 years. That's not an adequate time frame to build a nuclear plant because you're dealing with something that can destroy a state. The other 3 were floods. We had obviously we had the tsunami at Fukushima. We had the flood at Fort Calhoun, and now we had the Frankenstorm, Sandy, up the East Coast. And in all 3 of those, the pumps that cool the plant, the service water pumps, were at the hairy edge of what they were designed for at Fort Calhoun, likely over what they were designed for at Oyster Creek, and certainly over what they were designed for at Fukushima. So we've got situations that could create something we call the loss of the ultimate heat sink. And again, you can build a plant, you can harden a nuclear plant so it can withstand a tsunami or a tidal flood like we had at Oyster Creek with something called submersible pumps. But the industry doesn't want to spend that money. So what my advice is, we need to go back in time and look at what we have as a country determined to be design basis events and say, did we really make these plants strong enough? Because we've got an earthquake, a couple floods that might indicate that we're not building the nuclear plants as strong as they should be.
So you're not arguing that the design bases, whatever a plant is built to withstand, that it would withstand, but rather that there's not much of I guess I'd say margin of safety. If it's just a little bit more than what it was built to withstand, then there's a problem.
Yeah, let's look at North Anna. We're hearing the people that run the North Anna reactor say, well, it withstood the Richter 6 earthquake, or 5.8 or something like that, close. And of course it should. I mean, the engineers designed it to withstand a Richter 6, and they had a Richter 6. The problem is that if a Richter 6 happened in 30 years, then what's the probability of something worse? And it's got to be significant. And therefore, you don't build a nuclear plant for what happens every 30 years. You build a plant for what happens every 1,000 years. And we're not building them rigorously enough.
So you're talking about building a nuclear plant to withstand a 1,000-year event. But of course, with climate change, isn't all of this changing?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look at Oyster Creek. It was finished in 1969, which meant it was started in 1960, 62. And engineers in 1962 looked back over the historical record and determined what the worst hurricane was that could hit the area. Well, in the 55 years since this plant was designed, there's been a lot of global warming effects. And so suddenly now we're seeing a lot more energy in our storms than were anticipated when these plants were built 50 years ago. The same thing at Fort Calhoun. That was the plant that was completely surrounded, and my quote there was, "Sandbags and nuclear plants don't belong in the same sentence." That plant never anticipated that the Missouri River would be a mile wide. It was only because of a little bit of proactive work by the NRC, thank you NRC, 2 years before, that forced them to increase their floodworthiness, that Fort Calhoun was able to weather that flood. You know, it's very rare that I pat the NRC on the back, but that was one, Fort Calhoun. And I actually have a second one. The NRC did something this week that I'm proud of them for. This is the NRC staff met with the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards down in Washington and recommended that all of these old boiling water reactors, the Mark I and Mark II designs, have filtered, hardened vents installed on their containment. And the industry didn't want that, and I doubt the Nuclear Regulatory Commissioners want it. But the staff stood firm and pushed for something that frankly surprised me, that they were so adamant that a safety modification that needed to be made.
What are containment vents?
Well, the Mark I containment is this little inverted light bulb with a donut on the bottom. It was too small. And people knew it was too small in the 70s. Now, I think they should all be shut down, and I'm on record that they should be. But when people realized that the Mark I and Mark II containments could overpressurize, the industry was able to convince the NRC that they shouldn't shut them down, but they could put a vent in the side of the containment. You know, if you're going to contain, you contain. If you're going to vent, you vent. But you don't call it a containment if you've got a hole in the side of it. Well, all of those vents failed at Fukushima Daiichi, and all the containments leaked, and Unit 1, 2, and 3 all had explosions. So we know that filtered vents didn't work at Fukushima Daiichi, and the NRC now is demanding something called a hardened filtered vent, which is a little bit stronger Band-Aid than the Band-Aid that's on these plants now.
So then, Arnie, I assume there's a reason we're talking about containment venting right now. This is an old issue. This has been around as long as the Mark I BWRs have been around. Why are we talking about it now?
Well, you know, that the hearing was this week is obviously awfully important. I think the other piece of that is that here's Oyster Creek was exactly that design. So we've got a problem at a Mark I reactor, just like Daiichi 1, and with simultaneously a hearing in Washington on that same type reactor design. So it's a confluence of events that I just really felt like I owed it to the NRC staff to thank them for standing up for hardened filtered vents. At least it's a stronger Band-Aid than the Band-Aid we had before.
But it will cost industry.
It's going to cost around $20 million per plant. And if you remember the conversation we had last week, some of these plants are on the hairy edge of shutting down for economic reasons. So it could be the straw that breaks the camel's back and forces some of these plants to shut down, because no one wants to spend another $20 million on a 40-plus-year-old plant.
And that's going to bring us, I suppose, to our next topic of conversation. The Vogtle plant in Georgia is coming with a price tag. If you can talk about that.
Yeah, last week we talked about how the Kewanee plant was being shut down for economic reasons. Now, this is a plant that was 37 years old, but had a license to run till 60 years old, and it only cost $200 million when it was bought in 2005. And it was shut down by the company that owned it because they couldn't make any money. The nuclear plant staff and the fuel costs and all were much too high for the electric market that's out there now. Well, down in Georgia, they're building two plants at Vogtle, and those plants are going to be pushing $15 billion by the time they're done in 2016. They're claiming it might be $10 billion, but in fact, there will obviously be cost overruns. Now, this week, there was a lawsuit between the people building the plant and the people owning the plant. And the people building it say that the cost is going to increase by almost $1 billion, $900 million cost increase. Now, this plant is nowhere near done, so I'm sure there'll be more cost increases coming up. But a $900 million cost increase that they want the Vogtle plant to absorb.
Let me make sure I'm understanding this. We talked about the Kewanee plant that was a $200 million plant, and it's being shut down for economic reasons. And this plant is $10 billion at minimum?
Yeah, the cost increase at this plant is $900 million, which is 5 times more than the Kewanee plant ever cost. And yet Kewanee's shutting down, and Vogtle's basically saying, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
What's their plan to make money?
Well, the Public Service Commission in Georgia is co-opted and controlled by the utilities that it's supposed to be regulating. And basically what they're doing is they're guaranteed 11% return on their money. So they're going to pony up, let's say use $10 billion, but they're going to get 11% for the life of the plant. This is a good deal for the utility. Now, the bad deal is for the people in Georgia, because they're stuck with a plant that's going to have enormous costs, and their rates are going to go up enormously. The cost at the bus bar, which is where the electricity leaves these nuclear plants, will be 2 to 3 times more than other sources on the grid. So why is Georgia doing this? It's a great question, and I wish I had a good logical answer. I don't have a logical answer. The Public Utility Commission is not looking out for the people of Georgia, but instead is making a real lucrative deal with the people that are building the Vogtle reactor.
It sounds like, to me, the owners of the Vogtle reactor have a better financial situation than Fairwinds Energy Education.
Yeah, I think they'll spend more on lawyers' fees in a day than Fairwinds uses in a year to keep this site up and running. Which, dear viewers, I hope you can do something about. Any contribution is great. We are grateful for, and every day when I walk to the mail and find a note and a check, I am forever grateful. But we do need funds, and if you haven't contributed, we would love to have contributions, because frankly we have bills to pay, servers to run, broadcasts to put up, and Maggie and I aren't pulling any money out of this, but it does cost money to run the site. So let's think of the Vogtle plant and $900 million cost overruns, and we'll take 1/10 of 1% of that.
Last bit for this podcast, Arnie. We have a listener question asking. We have a listener writing us in. He's asking, why, when radioactivity measurements are taken, why are we only seeing cesium being reported? Why not any of the other radioactive isotopes that we know are out there?
Well, the Fukushima Daiichi plant released hundreds of different isotopes. A lot have decayed away already. But cesium is particularly easy to find. It gives off some very characteristic energy, and you can say, whoop, that particular decay was definitely cesium. So we measure cesium because it's easy to measure. That doesn't mean that the only thing out there is cesium. We know there's other isotopes, but they're much more difficult to measure. Cesium is a muscle seeker, and you find it in the meat of a fish, or the meat of a cow, for instance. But other isotopes like strontium are bone seekers, and they're much more difficult to detect when they're in a fish or when they're in a cow, because you've got to separate it out from the bone, and there's a very elaborate chemical procedure to measure cesium, to measure strontium.
Right.
In the environment. So there are dozens of isotopes still out there. When we talk about cesium, it's just because it's the easiest one to measure.
Arnie, thanks for coming on today.
I'm glad I could.
This podcast has been a presentation of Fairwinds Energy Education. You can catch us back here next Sunday and every Sunday to keep current on what's happening in the world of nuclear news. For Fairwinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.